Welcome to the untold story of the Civil War, where the real damage didn't end when the guns went quiet. In blood-soaked medic tents, doctors reached for bottles, opium, morphine, laudanum, faster than they reached for thread. This isn't just about coming home, it's about what was done under canvas and candlelight that followed men for the rest of their lives. And somewhere in that first dose, a quieter war began, one no one was trained to survive. If you enjoy drifting off to stories where survival meant bending the rules, and sometimes breaking yourself in the process, hit that like button and subscribe for more hauntingly human bedtime tales. This episode is part of our American Heritage collection, a cozy series of stories exploring the strangest, saddest, and most quietly unravelling lives of the 19th century. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is, because there's something oddly comforting about drifting off to tales of battlefield cures, flickering lanterns and wounds that didn't stay on the skin. Now dim the lights, get cozy, and slip into a world where the war was only half the story, and the real damage came after. You wake up in what smells like a barn and sounds like a slaughterhouse. Congratulations, you're not dead. Just in a Civil War field hospital, which is the next best thing. Assuming your definition of best includes sawdust, moaning, and the faint scent of boiled socks. Something is throbbing. You hope it's your leg. It's not. Your leg is gone, or mostly gone. You're afraid to look, and honestly the blanket smells like someone else's fear, so you leave it alone. A man walks by. Possibly a nurse, possibly someone who wandered in for warmth, and presses something into your mouth without even making eye contact. It's a pill. It tastes like despair rolled in ash. You swallow it because you've learned not to argue with strangers holding bandages. 10 seconds later, the ceiling stops spinning. Your pain slips back like a tide going out. You feel warm. You feel not better exactly, but further away from worse. And in this place, that's a miracle. You've just met your new best friend, Opium. She's quiet, she's dependable, she doesn't ask questions, and she's going to follow you for the rest of your life, whether you want her to or not. Right now, you don't care. You're just grateful the flies have stopped buzzing so loudly, or maybe you just can't hear them anymore. Either way, it's progress. In the grand tradition of military medicine, Civil War hospitals were a curious combination of innovation, improvisation, and outright panic. If you were lucky enough to survive a battlefield wound, you were wheeled, dragged, or carried into a tent that smelled like blood, smoke, and whatever passed for antiseptic. Spoiler, nothing did. There were two kinds of pain relief available to the average soldier: chloroform during surgery and opium after. One knocked you out. The other convinced you that being conscious wasn't so bad after all. Opium came in many forms: pills, tinctures, powders. It was swallowed, dissolved, or, later on, injected. But the method didn't matter. The result was the same: blissful detachment from the fact that half your arm was in a bucket somewhere, and no one had changed your socks in 6 weeks. Doctors weren't naive. They knew it was addictive. They also knew it worked, and between the two, they made the reasonable decision to not let you scream yourself into cardiac arrest. So they handed out pills, and more pills, and when you asked for more, they called it a therapeutic need, at least until you showed up 5 months later, asking for your 7th refill and talking to a tree. The Union Army ordered somewhere between 5 and 10 million opium pills during the war. That's not a typo. That's supply and demand. You can't fight a war on hardtack and hope. You need pharmaceuticals, and if those pharmaceuticals happen to be chemically clingy, well, that was tomorrow's problem. Soldiers quickly learned that opium wasn't just for bullet wounds, it was for everything. Toothaches, cramps, anxiety, boredom, existential dread. You name it, opium smoothed it over like a warm, drowsy blanket. And the best part, it was free. At least at first. Provided to you by the fine gentlemen of the US Army Medical Department, who couldn't tell you what bacteria was but could prescribe a powerful narcotic with the confidence of a man guessing at a poker table. Once you started on opium, it was hard to stop. Not because it felt so good, though it did, but because everything else felt so much worse. One soldier, Private John Billings of the 10th Massachusetts, wrote home in 1863 from a field hospital near Brandy Station, "I've been given a black powder which dulls the hurt enough for me to sleep. The doctor says it is opium. I shall need more tomorrow, as the pain grows when I do not take it." He wasn't unusual. By mid-war, men like Billings weren't just taking opium to sleep, they were planning their days around it. It was the most common item requested by name in hospital records, second only to clean socks. And if you're wondering how often those got delivered, let's just say, keep dreaming. Many men walked away from the war missing limbs. Others walked away with all their parts intact and a little brown bottle they kept hidden in their coat. They'd survived the musket balls, the bayonets, and the cannon fire. But they hadn't survived the cure, and as it turns out, not all war wounds are visible. Some come in 40-grain doses and taste like burnt dirt. But pain relief was only part of the story, because if there was one thing the army feared more than enemy fire, it was something far more common, something wet, violent, and coming out both ends. You're not dying from a bullet, you're dying from your own digestive system. At this point, you've stopped praying for glory and started praying for a cork. Every time you sit, squat, or breathe too confidently, your stomach stages a full-blown rebellion. You've visited the latrine so often, the guy digging the trench waved hello this morning like you were regulars at a cafe. You have no wounds, no visible injuries, just velocity. Your insides are a military campaign unto themselves, rapid, disorganized, and somehow still managing to cause civilian casualties. Your commanding officer stopped asking why you were late to roll call. The tent smells like a mix of regret and boiled wool. The last time you sneezed, a man cried. And then, mercy. A surgeon with an apron that looks like it's lost several arguments hands you a pill the size of a musket ball. It smells like mildew and despair, but you don't care. You'll eat anything that promises to keep your internal organs internal. You dry swallow it, eyes watering, and wait. 5 minutes later, the storm calms. Your gut falls silent. The flies move on. You might even survive breakfast. You don't know what's in the pill, but you're prepared to marry it. No one tells you it's opium. No one mentions it's the same drug they gave the man in the next cot who's missing 2 limbs and now thinks he's a pigeon. You don't ask questions. You just nod slowly and wonder if there's any chance of getting 2 more. And just like that, you've joined the quietest addiction epidemic no one will talk about for another 150 years. All because you ate something the colour of a shoe and trusted it more than your colon. The Civil War is remembered for many things: bloody battles, heroic sacrifice, questionable facial hair. But less appreciated is the fact that diarrhea was one of the most common, most feared, and most utterly disgusting enemies of the war. Roughly 3/4 of all Union soldiers suffered from chronic diarrhea or dysentery at some point during their service. That's not battlefield gossip. That's a documented medical catastrophe. And when faced with rivers of intestinal regret, doctors reached for the only tool they had: opium. Not for pain, not for sleep, just to cork the floodgates. Opium, it turns out, slows the bowels. Dramatically. And in an era before IV drips, rehydration salts, or literally any understanding of microbiology, that was good enough. So soldiers were handed opium pills by the handful. Not because they were dying, at least not immediately, but because they were dangerously close to soiling their enlistment papers. One Union doctor stationed in Kentucky wrote in his field notes in 1862, "We administer opium freely to halt the flux. It is most effective in reducing evacuations, though care must be taken not to overly constipate the patient, as this causes complaint." Complaint in this case being a polite 19th century way of saying agonised groaning followed by a very loud request for prune juice. Still, doctors kept dispensing, soldiers kept taking, and no one paused long enough to wonder what happened if the diarrhea stopped but the craving didn't. It wasn't uncommon for soldiers to self-dose. Many carried laudanum in their kits, often sent from home at their own request. One such soldier, Corporal George Naylor of the 4th Vermont Infantry, wrote home from Andersonville Prison, "Please send more laudanum. It is all that quiets my belly, and the surgeon here is out. If I am to live through this place, I will need it." Naylor was not exaggerating. In a camp where water came from a stream that doubled as a latrine and a burial ground, Laudanum was survival. It was also slow poison. The trouble with using opium to treat diarrhea wasn't just the addiction risk. It was the fact that nobody kept track. There were no warning labels, no prescription limits, no helpful pamphlets explaining that daily use might eventually replace your appetite with a constant gnawing need for another dose. So soldiers began to rely on it, some out of desperation, some out of habit, some because they no longer trusted their own digestive systems not to betray them at breakfast. By the time the war ended, countless men had gone from bleeding out to drying up, with the same drug causing both miracles and misery. They came home thinner, older, and still carrying the same brown bottles they'd clutched during the worst days of camp life. And now, they didn't just take opium to stop the pain. They took it because it had become the only thing that made them feel normal, and that's where things start to shift. Because while opium was excellent at halting bodily disasters, it didn't stay in the gut for long. Soon it was moving into the heart, into the mind, into something worse. You're a medical miracle. At least that's what the surgeon tells you. In reality, you're just the least dead person in the tent. Your fever broke. Your bowels stopped reenacting Pickett's charge. You even managed to choke down hardtack without needing last rites. By Civil War standards, you're thriving. By modern standards, you're one raccoon sighting away from a rabies diagnosis. But something feels wrong. Not gangrene wrong, not they left a bullet in me wrong. No, this is worse. You're sober. It creeps up slow. Your skin itches. Your legs won't stop bouncing. The guy in the next cot starts humming, and you briefly consider smothering him with your blanket. It's not pain exactly. It's just life, raw and unfiltered, and you don't like it one bit. Then it clicks. No pill, no laudanum, no magical little opium button that turns the world from unbearable to slightly bearable if you squint. You've been off it for half a day, and suddenly reality feels like a personal attack. So you do what any rational soldier would do. You limp up to the steward, clutch your side dramatically, and mutter something about phantom pain. Maybe throw in intestinal distress for good measure. He looks at you the way a man looks at a dog begging for scraps, but he hands it over anyway, because no one wants to be the guy remembered as the monster who refused morphine to a veteran. You pop the pill, bitter as betrayal. 10 minutes later, you're floating again. The pain softens, the chewing noise fades, the urge to strangle your neighbour subsides to a dull throb, and in that warm, fuzzy silence you realise something important. You're not taking this stuff to cure anything anymore. You're taking it because you like who you are on it better than who you are off it. The trouble with opium in the Civil War wasn't just that it worked, it was that it worked too well. A man staggered into the hospital half dead, was given morphine, and weeks later he'd still be hovering near the dispensary door insisting on lingering pain in a limb that had long since been buried in Virginia soil. Surgeons began to notice the pattern. Some wounds healed, but the request for opium never stopped. At first no one wanted to admit it. These were the Republic's soldiers, citizens in uniform, veterans of Antietam and Fredericksburg, not the sort of men who would lose themselves to a bottle. Addiction was a word whispered about city drunkards, not the boys in blue, but the evidence mounted. By 1864, the Boston Medical and Surgical Journal reported a growing fondness for the effects of opium among returned invalids. Pharmacists wrote about soldiers coming in twice in a week, sometimes daily, demanding laudanum or morphine with a tone that suggested this was less a request than a necessity. It wasn't only the wounded. Diarrhea and camp fever had sent men to the surgeon's tent for months on end, and once the symptoms calmed, many discovered they still needed their dose to feel whole. One Confederate veteran later confessed, "I found myself unable to part with the laudanum bottle, though my bowels had long since healed. It seemed to soothe more than my stomach." Army surgeons weren't blind to the risk. Medical journals circulated during the war noted with unease that opium was habit-forming. But in a world without antibiotics or modern painkillers, opium was the only reliable tool they had. So they gave it out freely, hoping to solve today's suffering and leaving tomorrow's consequences for someone else to reckon with. By the last years of the war, the drug had shifted from treatment to habit. Some men hoarded pills in their kits, taking them secretly when the surgeon wasn't looking. Others grew creative, feigning intestinal cramps or phantom pains, crafting just enough drama to earn another bottle. And when the hospital's supply ran thin, the letters home began. Families were asked to tuck laudanum into parcels alongside socks and biscuits. It was medicine sent through the mail not to heal wounds, but to keep a soldier's hands from trembling and his nights from unravelling. The habit did not discriminate. Generals with shattered arms and privates with nothing more than camp fever could both end their day with the same little vial beside them. Relief was not measured by rank, it was measured by supply, and as word spread, an underground trade stirred within the camps. Soldiers bartered rations, favours, even clothing for opium, creating a shadow economy fueled by bottles and packets. What began as battlefield mercy had quietly reshaped army life. The war was fought with rifles and cannon, but survival increasingly depended on a small brown bottle, sometimes given by a surgeon, sometimes mailed from home, and sometimes passed hand to hand in the dim corners of a camp. You've developed a new morning ritual. It used to involve roll call, maybe coffee if the fire hadn't gone out. Now it involves forging a convincing letter to your mother that says, without saying, "Please send drugs." You put effort into it. Flowery handwriting, sad little phrases like, "My nerves remain unquiet and the nights are long, dear mother." You throw in a mention of God and country, and maybe that one time she dropped you on your head as a baby, whatever it takes to soften the request. You're not addicted, of course. You just really, really need the exact same bottle of laudanum she mailed you last time, plus maybe 2 more. And if she could wrap them in socks so the quartermaster doesn't catch on, that'd be ideal. The moment the package arrives, you become temporarily religious. You unwrap it like it's a relic from Bethlehem. Inside, socks, useless. A stale biscuit, insulting. And finally, the bottle. It smells like death in a bottle, and it tastes like someone boiled licorice in nail polish remover. You love it. You drink like a man possessed. You feel the tension melt from your shoulders, your hands stop twitching, and suddenly, Private Larrabee's constant throat clearing isn't a war crime anymore. The tent feels warmer, your thoughts feel slower. Everything gets just fuzzy enough to survive until tomorrow. You lean back on your cot, hands behind your head like a man who's got it all figured out. Sure, you're at war. Sure, you haven't bathed since Appomattox was a suggestion. But right now, you've got laudanum and a quiet gut, and honestly, what more could a man want? You close your eyes and feel almost human again, and that's when it hits you. You're not waiting for the war to end, you're just waiting for the next bottle. By the midpoint of the Civil War, battlefield hospitals had become more than just places for surgery. They were quiet incubators of dependence. Soldiers who'd never heard the word addiction were learning its rhythm through repetition. Injury, relief, recovery, craving. But unlike wounds, addiction needed restocking. And when the dispensary shelves ran empty, or the surgeons grew suspicious, soldiers turned to the only reliable logistics system they knew, the United States Postal Service. Men began writing letters home, dozens of them, requesting medicine by name or coded phrases. Soothing syrup. Restorative tonic. That dark bottle from Dr. Pierce. Some weren't even subtle. One corporal reportedly asked his mother for the same brown bottle you sent after Chickamauga, the one that helped me sleep through the cannon fire. Families complied. They weren't pharmacists, they were worried parents. If a soldier said the tonic helped his pain, they sent it. If he said it cured the gut gripes, they sent it faster. Many had no idea they were mailing liquid opium. Even fewer realised they were fueling a habit that wouldn't end with the war. The mail order system wasn't limited to mothers and sweethearts. Some soldiers paid civilians to procure bottles from local apothecaries and smuggle them through supply lines. Others struck deals with stewards and nurses exchanging extra rations, stolen blankets, or even personal effects for a fresh dose. The demand was so high that laudanum became a form of currency. In some camps, it could buy better food, a dry pair of socks, or a guaranteed night off latrine duty. A soldier with a full bottle could afford comfort in a place where comfort was scarce, and the longer the war dragged on, the more casual it became. What had once been a carefully rationed treatment now passed hand to hand like chewing tobacco. No one questioned it. No one paused to ask why so many men without fresh injuries or illnesses, were still dosing daily. A veteran of the 14th Indiana later wrote in a memoir, "I carried a bottle of laudanum through half of 64. It did not fix my pain, but it made me forget I had any." For many that was reason enough, and if they needed more, they knew how to get it. Right home, right fast, right before the shaking started. Because if there was one thing every soldier knew by then, it was this. If you wanted to stay numb, you had to keep the mail moving. The war didn't just create addicts, it created a logistics chain. One that bypassed doctors entirely, but even the most reliable bottle from home couldn't mask what was happening in the long run. Because soon, even the army's physicians started noticing a change in the men they treated, not just in body, but in spirit. And some began to ask the uncomfortable question, what if the cure was becoming the new disease? You're fine, completely fine. You're just sweating through your shirt at midnight trying to remember your own name and occasionally arguing with your blanket. But it's fine. You've had no opium for 2 days. Not because you don't want it, but because the surgeon decided you were doing well enough to try going without. You smiled when he said that. You smiled so hard your teeth squeaked, and then you excused yourself politely and walked behind the supply tent to scream into a sock. You're not in pain exactly. Your leg doesn't hurt. Your stomach doesn't hurt. Your soul hurts, and that's apparently not considered a medical condition. You lie on your cot like a damp corpse, watching shadows move on the ceiling and trying not to commit a small crime every time someone coughs too loudly. The guy in the next bunk has been whistling the same 4 notes of Battle Cry of Freedom for the past 20 minutes, and you're seriously debating whether 4 notes is enough justification for homicide. But no, you're strong, you're manly. You were told suffering builds character, and you have so much character now that it might actually be toxic. You don't need the pills. You just missed the way they made you feel like your bones weren't screaming and your thoughts didn't bite. You're doing great. Really. You only cried once today, and it wasn't even a full cry, just one heroic masculine tear. In the latter years of the war, as morphine and laudanum use surged, a cultural dilemma quietly took root in army hospitals. It wasn't just about dosage anymore, it was about dignity, or at least the illusion of it. Physicians, under pressure to maintain discipline and harden the troops, began rationing opium more selectively. Some men were cut off without warning, others were told to toughen up, as if raw endurance could treat neurological withdrawal. To admit dependency wasn't medical, it was moral, a failure of the will, an unmanly softness unbecoming of a soldier. So instead of addressing addiction, the army simply rebranded it as weakness, and left the men to battle themselves. One surgeon in a New York field hospital wrote in a letter, "I find myself limiting the use of morphia in cases where pain is tolerable, for I fear some of the men are becoming reliant." He did not define tolerable, likely because he still considered sawing through bone without anesthesia to be within acceptable limits. Those who asked for more were watched. Those who demanded it were labelled irritable, hysterical, or, worst of all, unfit for duty, which for a soldier was social death. So most just suffered in silence, too ashamed to admit that the thing they needed was the very thing they were supposed to rise above. Men who'd been lauded for their bravery under fire were now ridiculed for asking for what had once been freely handed out in hospital tents. What made it worse was that their pain didn't always have a clear physical source. The wounds were invisible. Restless limbs, chest tightness, tremors, sleeplessness. That slow creeping dread that seemed to claw up from the gut. They tried to hide it. They picked fights. They skipped meals. They ground their teeth into dust. But even those hardened by battle couldn't out-tough a body that had learned to survive with chemical assistance. And when they broke, because many did, they broke quietly. Some slipped away from the lines. Some found new ways to trade for opium behind the backs of their officers, and some, too many, were marched into asylum doors instead of back home. There they would be labelled not as casualties of war, but as madmen, weak men, men who couldn't hold their liquor, or their laudanum. But long before the padded cells and locked doors, there were whispers in the camps. Whispers that the army didn't just have a medical problem on its hands, It had a moral crisis. Because once doctors start blaming weakness instead of withdrawal, the cure becomes cruelty. And in that space between pain and punishment, the asylum doors began to creak open. You always imagined that if you survived the war, you'd come home to a hero's welcome, not end up in a room that smells like boiled cabbage and regret. Congratulations, you're not in the grave, but you're not quite in the world either. You're in an institution, which is 19th century for we don't know what else to do with you. No one calls it an asylum out loud, but the walls have bars and the nurses have the kind of faces that say, "I've seen things before breakfast." You're not dangerous, just inconvenient. Too jumpy, too sweaty, too many requests for medicine when the surgeon's back was turned. The army doesn't do rehabs. It does warehouses for the broken. Your roommate thinks he's General Grant. His name is Leonard, and he smells like vinegar and a bad idea, but you let him give orders because at least he's entertaining. On the other side is a man who hums Battle Cry of Freedom in a minor key all night long. You're not sure if he's doing it to annoy you or because he can't stop. Either way, you've fantasized about smothering him with your pillow at least twice this morning. A nurse walks past your cot, glancing at you like you're a particularly dull errand. You flash your best, charming veteran smile. She gives you the same look she probably gives the chamber pot. You shift under your blanket, aware that your uniform still reeks of the last time you were calmed with laudanum. You once believed suffering was noble. Now you know it's just exhausting. You used to be a soldier. Now you're a cautionary tale with a pulse. And the worst part? You're sober enough to notice. By the end of the Civil War, the line between patient and prisoner had blurred. Hospitals, once overcrowded with the wounded, began quietly shifting certain veterans into more permanent housing. Facilities designed not for healing, but for holding. These were the asylums, the state hospitals, the homes for the feeble-minded and moral defectives. Names changed, but the reality remained. The war had created a population of men who could no longer function in peace, and no one quite knew what to do with them. Many of these men were not raving or violent. They were simply broken in ways no one could see. Nightmares, tremors, sudden outbursts, panic when the medicine ran out. Some had become erratic after being cut off from morphine. Others had never quite come down from it. The 1867 records from the New Jersey State Lunatic Asylum noted an increase in male admissions labelled as soldiers formerly in good standing, now suffering from melancholia and agitation, brought on by prolonged exposure to opiate medicines. That's the polite way of saying, he got hooked in the war and lost his grip in the aftermath. These weren't isolated cases. Asylums across the country quietly took in Civil War veterans who arrived not with open wounds, but with jittery hands and vacant eyes. They were often kept apart from other patients. Some were labelled as nervous invalids. Others were filed under moral insanity, and nearly all of them were treated as if their pain was self-inflicted. There was little to no treatment, no weaning protocols, no therapeutic care, just confinement. Cold baths, quiet rooms, and heavy doses of bromides or chloral hydrate. One drug swapped for another, usually with less effectiveness and far more sedation. Families who had once sent care packages were now signing commitment forms. Communities that celebrated returning heroes quietly looked the other way when those same men couldn't hold a job or keep their tempers. And the hospitals didn't ask too many questions. After all, the war had ended. The medals had been handed out. The nation had moved on. The only ones who hadn't were the men who still shook when they slept. The ones who still saw things in the firelight. The ones who reached for bottles that never came and couldn't explain why their hearts raced every time a door slammed. These weren't madmen. These were addicts, survivors, veterans whose wounds were just a little harder to see. But once they were labelled, once they passed through the asylum gates, they became something else entirely forgotten. There were no parades for the ones locked inside, no speeches, no headstones with flags, just silence, and a small barred window overlooking a world that no longer made room for broken soldiers. And while some were hidden away in wards and sanitariums, others tried to rebuild outside the gates. But they brought the war home with them, in the bottle, in the bloodstream, in every hollow hour of the night when the shaking came back. Because the battlefield may have been left behind, but for some men, the war would never end. Freedom tastes like warm gin and regret. You've been out of the asylum for 3 weeks, though time's a bit of a blur when your main hobby is trying not to scream into your own hat. The army said you were fit for civilian life, which is adorable considering you just spent 10 minutes arguing with a broom you thought was your commanding officer. You now live above a saloon, not in it, above it, on a floor so thin you can hear every poor life decision happening below in real time. The wallpaper is peeling, the window doesn't close, and the mattress is stuffed with what you hope is hay. But it's fine, you're a veteran. You've slept in worse places, like swamps and shallow graves, and one time, a cannon barrel. Long story. You tried to go clean. You really did. You made it 5 full hours before you were sweating like a preacher at a poker game and seriously considering drinking the furniture polish. Then along came Eustace. Eustace is not a doctor. He has most of his teeth and sells tonics from a box he keeps under a horse blanket. He wears a cravat that looks like it's been through an actual war. But he doesn't ask questions. You hand him a few coins and a vague nod. He hands you a bottle labelled Soothing Elixir for Men. You don't even read the ingredients. You already know what's in it. Salvation with a side of organ damage. You take a swig and feel the warm fog roll in. Your jaw unclenches. Your thoughts stop tap dancing on your spine. And for one blissful moment you forget that your roommate is a rat. And your landlord thinks you're a blacksmith named Carl. You don't drink to get high. You drink to unclench. You drink to forget the cannon fire, the blood, and the sound hardtack makes when it snaps in half. And if that means sipping questionable medicine behind a saloon while pretending to be just tired, then so be it. You came home from the war with half a soul and a full tolerance, and now Eustace is your pharmacist, your confessor, and your therapist, which is honestly more than the government ever offered. The end of the Civil War saw more than just parades and amputations. It unleashed thousands of addicted veterans into a country that had no vocabulary, no policy, and no patience for their condition. With army dispensaries closed and field hospitals shuttered, many former soldiers turned to local apothecaries who, thanks to almost no regulation, were happy to supply opium-based remedies for anything from rheumatism to homesickness. Bottles of laudanum, morphine and opium pills were sold over the counter, often advertised as soothing syrups, nerve tonics, or heroic restoratives. In towns across the country, veterans could be found dosing themselves behind barns, in taverns, or on the porches of boarding houses, chasing the only thing that had ever reliably brought them peace: chemical silence. The medical community remained largely divided. Some doctors condemned the practice outright, calling it moral weakness. Others offered private prescriptions, quiet deals made with old patients they'd once treated in the field. One surgeon from Ohio wrote in his diary in 1868, "I see more of my former patients now in the apothecary's line than I ever did on the battlefield. Most ask not for healing, but for the means to endure their waking hours." But it wasn't just the doctors or the pharmacists that made post-war addiction possible. It was the booming patent medicine industry. Entrepreneurs with an eye for profit began bottling opiates under colourful names and selling them through travelling salesmen, catalogues, and posters nailed to trees. You didn't need a prescription. You just needed a few coins and a story about nervous exhaustion. Veterans made perfect customers. They already knew what opium did. They already needed it. And no one was watching anymore. There were no surgeons counting pills, no nurses charting symptoms, just a man, a bottle, and the long, hollow echo of everything he saw in the trenches. In the years following the war, entire communities would come to know the familiar sight of a veteran slumped on a bench, trembling, bottle clutched loosely in hand, not drunk, not raving, just trying to remember what it felt like to breathe without shaking. And the businesses that fed this quiet epidemic, they kept growing, because in post-war America no one wanted to talk about trauma, but everyone was willing to sell something to make it go away. Some men kept it hidden, others wore it openly, but nearly all of them eventually had to find a way to function among civilians who had no idea what it was like to survive a battle you kept reliving every time the bottle ran dry. You've tried everything. Prayer, deep breathing, yelling at the wind. None of it cured your twitchy nerves, or your tendency to scream every time a kettle whistles. So today, you're trying medicine. Real medicine. You know it's real because the bottle has a drawing of a beaver wearing a monocle, and anything with a monocle is obviously trustworthy. The label reads, Dr. Farnsworth's Reanimating Drops, a sovereign cure for all ailments of the mind, spirit and bowels. Perfect. You have at least 2 of those, probably all 3. You buy it from a man with exactly 1 eyebrow and 0 follow-up questions. The bottle is warm. You're not sure why. You take a sip anyway. It tastes like the devil's mouthwash, equal parts turpentine, licorice, and something you're 40% sure is horse shampoo. But within seconds, your eyeballs stop twitching, and your knees stop writing Morse code against each other. You feel calm, suspiciously calm. You take a second sip. Now you're smiling. You don't remember why, but you're just so pleased. The sun is warmer. Birds sound like a symphony. A squirrel makes eye contact with you and you feel emotionally seen. This is fine, totally fine. You sit down on a stump and begin giving unsolicited life advice to a passing child. He sprints away, screaming. You nod wisely. He'll thank me later, you whisper to a passing bush. You've officially crossed the line from former soldier to local town character. You're now the man mothers warn their children not to talk to, but only because you keep saying things like, the squirrels know who's watching. Still, you're functional, sort of. You sleep at night. You don't throw punches in the marketplace. And when someone asks what you're taking, you tell them proudly, Dr. Farnsworth's soothing anti-hysteria extract, which as far as you're concerned is Latin for, leave me alone, I feel fantastic. Patent medicine was not a new invention, but after the Civil War, it entered a golden age, built on the backs of broken veterans and clever men with access to printing presses. These medicines rarely involved a physician, and almost never involved science, but they did involve marketing, and that turned out to be far more effective. Bottles with names like Aunt May's Nerve Tonic, Dr. Haverley's Vital Fluid, and Hero's Friend, a remedy for the battlefield mind, began appearing in drugstores, general stores, and even barbershops. They promised miracles. They delivered mostly sedation, and for men struggling with the lingering wounds of war, anxiety, insomnia, tremors, melancholy, it was good enough. Labels were often vague, promising to treat female complaints, veterans' distress, or general unease. And inside those bottles, typically a base of alcohol, laudanum, morphine, chloroform, or occasionally cocaine, sometimes all of the above. In the absence of regulation, companies flourished. One popular formula, Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup, was originally marketed for teething children. It contained morphine. And if it worked for babies, it worked for grown men who hadn't slept since Antietam. No prescription needed, no questions asked. This created a post-war culture where addiction was effectively commodified. It became something you could buy from a smiling clerk, wrapped in brown paper and labelled relief. It was sold as patriotic, even noble. One 1870s advertisement for Soldiers' Rest Drops promised to quell the soldier's stormy mind without dulling his noble heart. Behind the soft language and decorative fonts was the same drug soldiers had begged for in the trenches, just with better branding and a price tag. And so, thousands of men, many of them veterans, walked into druggists with trembling hands and walked out with glass bottles that would buy them another week of stillness, another week of sleep, another week where they didn't wake up thinking they were still under fire, but it couldn't last, because with no regulation and no limits, the strength of these tonics began to rise. So did the consequences. Some men overdosed, some mixed tonics with alcohol and vanished into stupor, and some simply stopped functioning entirely. A country that once saluted its soldiers now sold them sedatives at every corner, and no one seemed to notice how many were slipping through the cracks. At least not until the next wave of patients started showing up in hospitals, asylums and jail cells. Not from wounds, not from battle, but from the cure itself. You're done. This time, for real, no more opium, no more syrup, tonic, cordial, elixir, drops, drafts, or Dr. McFadden's comforting goo. You're going clean. You wake up full of resolve and half a biscuit. The resolve was intentional. The biscuit is a mystery. You sit up, sweat already pouring off you like you're training for a very damp marathon. Your heart is beating like it owes someone money. Your left eyelid is twitching the battle hymn of the Republic. You are medically speaking not thriving. But you hold the line. You tell yourself, this is just my body detoxifying. That sounds scientific. You definitely read that somewhere. Or overheard it from a man yelling behind the pharmacy. Hour 3. You pick a fight with a chair. It looked smug. Hour 5. You apologise to the chair. You sob into its armrest and call it the only one who understands. By sunset, you're lying shirtless on the floorboards, shaking like a maraca and writing your last will and testament in pencil on a biscuit wrapper. You leave your boots to no one because no one deserves them. You try breathing exercises, you try prayer, you try screaming into a pillow, but the pillow screams back. You're not even craving the high anymore. You just want your skeleton to stop trying to evacuate your body one vertebra at a time. You want to blink without hallucinating that Abraham Lincoln is judging you from the rafters. You whisper to the ceiling, just one more drop and then I'll really quit. The ceiling doesn't respond. It's tired of your lies. You would be ashamed, but shame requires energy, and all of yours is currently being used to not cry about the way the floorboards are breathing. You're a war-hardened veteran. You once survived a bayonet charge. Now you're losing a slap fight to your own nervous system. But it's fine. Totally fine. You're doing great. Just don't ask the biscuit wrapper, it knows too much. Long before the word withdrawal entered modern vocabulary, Civil War veterans were experiencing it with ferocity and silence. They didn't know the term for it. They just knew that when the medicine stopped, the suffering didn't, and in fact it often got worse. The withdrawal symptoms from opiates were brutal. Men reported everything from uncontrollable shaking and nausea to insomnia, aggression, and what newspapers politely called episodes of melancholia and unprovoked distress. There were no support systems, no rehabilitation clinics, no idea that what they were going through was biological and not simply a failure of moral resolve. So they suffered in secret, assuming they were weak or mad or cursed. Some tried to quit cold turkey, locking themselves in barns or boarding house rooms with nothing but vinegar, blankets, and a Bible. Others turned to alcohol to dull the withdrawal, resulting in a grim overlap between opium dependency and alcoholism. One former infantryman wrote in an 1871 letter, "I find I cannot go a week without the bottle. When I stop, I shake and weep and my bones feel loose. Whiskey helps little, but it helps me not to scream." Many soldiers relapsed repeatedly. They made solemn declarations of sobriety, only to return to the bottle days later when the headaches started crawling up their spines. Civilian life didn't understand these lapses. Families grew impatient. Employers fired men for drunkenness that was in truth desperate self-medication. The medical community remained largely silent on the subject. Addiction was still considered a moral failing, an affliction of weak men and idle women. There was no distinction made between chemical dependency and personal vice. Those who did manage to get clean often described it in violent near-biblical terms: purging, penance, a battle of will over flesh. But most simply fell back into the cycle, not because they lacked strength, but because they lacked support. In the end, the war taught men how to endure pain, but not how to live without its cure, and so the bottles remained, tucked into coat pockets, hidden in bedrolls, passed between trembling hands in back alleys and country kitchens. Not for pleasure, not even for escape, just to stop the shaking. You've hit a new low, buying your medicine like it's candy. Except it's not candy. It's Reverend Goodwin's gentle drops for the nervous and overwrought, which, if the label is to be believed, is suitable for children, the elderly, and apparently war veterans who sweat through their hats at the sight of a spoon. The bottle shows a smiling lamb and a cherubic baby. You're neither lamb nor cherub. You're a man with trembling hands and a nervous system that sounds like a telegraph line in a lightning storm. But you figure if it calms babies, it might at least stop you from pacing holes in the floorboards. You hand over your coins at the counter. The clerk doesn't ask why you're buying something called gentle drops. He's seen enough men like you to know better. He just wraps the bottle and slides it across the counter with the same look he probably uses for flour and nails. Outside, you try to act normal, respectable, just another man picking up tonics for a cough. But as soon as you turn the corner, you uncork the thing behind the church like a sinner sneaking communion wine. It smells like licorice and chloroform and tastes like despair steeped in peppermint. Perfect. Within seconds, your jaw stops clenching. The world stops vibrating. The ghost of that screaming lieutenant from Antietam stops whispering in your ear about bayonet drills. You lean against the wall, sip again, and feel your pulse slow. For a brief, glorious moment, you're not a bundle of nerves and regret. You're a man with a plan. Sure, the plan involves sneaking children's medicine behind a church and pretending you're just tired, but still, it's a plan. You straighten your coat and stroll away like you're fine, totally fine, absolutely fine. The bottle rattles in your pocket like a guilty conscience, and in that sound you know exactly what you've become. Not a patient, not a soldier, not even a customer. Just another man trying to buy back silence, one dose at a time. By the 1870s, opium was no longer something you got from a surgeon. It had become a consumer good, sold in polished wooden shops, printed in catalogues, and advertised with friendly fonts on posters nailed to fence posts across the country. This transformation didn't happen overnight, but it happened fast. Veterans who had once relied on army stewards and hospital dispensaries now turned to a booming over-the-counter addiction economy that flourished on familiarity and denial. In one edition of Godey's Lady's Book, a popular household magazine, there was an ad for Dr. Bromley's invigorating essence, claiming it could restore lost spirits, dull anxieties, and calm the rages of the soul. It made no mention of the opium content because it didn't have to. Everyone knew, and no one cared. Pharmacies didn't just sell the drugs, they built loyalty around them. Customers were recommended new brands, offered tastings, and even given discounts for bulk purchases. Apothecaries kept quiet ledgers of regular buyers, veterans mostly, men who showed up with trembling hands and rehearsed excuses. One Missouri pharmacist wrote in a private letter, "Half the soldiers in this town now require daily nerve tonics, and most would trade their coat buttons for a bottle. We do not ask what ails them, we simply fill the request." In smaller towns, men would pool money to buy larger bottles and divide them among themselves, rationing out drops like rations from the battlefield. It became not only acceptable, but ordinary, a new kind of daily ritual. You bathed, you shaved, and you took your syrup. This normalization made the addiction invisible. No one was drunk, no one was raving. Men went to work, raised families, voted in elections, all while carefully managing their chemical leash. The shift wasn't just medical, it was cultural. Opiates had been transformed from battlefield relief to lifestyle product. The edge it took off wasn't just pain, it was memory, and for thousands of veterans that edge was all that stood between them and collapse. But as the market grew, so did the strength of the products. Formulas were enhanced, dosages increased, and soon some men found themselves unable to function without 2 or 3 bottles a week. Their tolerance rose, their lives shrank, and the thing that once saved them now ran their days. This was no longer about war wounds, this was habit, dependence, and the worst part, it didn't even feel like addiction. It just felt like Tuesday. You're not quitting opium, you're just pausing it. Like a polite gentleman pausing a waltz. Very refined, very temporary, just taking a short break before your internal organs file a restraining order. You've decided to get clean the natural way. Fresh air, manual labour, and violent bone-deep regret. So now you're behind your cousin's barn, attempting to reset your constitution, which currently feels like it's being rebuilt by raccoons with hammers. You thought hauling fence posts might be therapeutic. Turns out shaking like a tambourine while holding sharp tools is not ideal. You try to look useful. You nod solemnly. You pick up a post. You drop the post. You apologise to the post. You wipe your brow dramatically like a tragic character in a soap opera, even though it's only 9:17 a.m, and you've accomplished roughly the same workload as a decorative wheelbarrow. Someone offers you coffee. You flinch like they just pulled a gun. You mumble something about cutting back on stimulants, then immediately spill water all over your shirt while trying to drink from a bucket like it's a goblet of dignity. By midday, you're lying in the grass having a deep emotional conversation with a passing goat. You name him Admiral Pickle. He understands you. You're confident of that. You miss the bottle, not the taste, not the euphoria. just the brief, glorious sensation of not actively unravelling like a woolsock in a hurricane. You tell yourself you're building character. You tell yourself you're reclaiming your life. But your hands won't stop twitching, your teeth hurt for no reason, and the sound of a woodpecker in the distance makes you want to eat dirt. And if your cousin just so happens to keep a dusty bottle of cough syrup in the pantry that's 80% morphine and 20% denial, well, you've already come so far. What's one little hiccup in your healing journey? For many veterans, addiction didn't look like the chaotic back-alley version portrayed in later eras. It looked like this: quiet suffering in rural kitchens, barns and bedrooms. Men who tried to white-knuckle their way through withdrawal without help, without information, and without any system of support. What they had instead was coffee, and the terrible belief that if they just worked harder, prayed longer, or stopped complaining, they'd somehow return to normal. The post-war self-help movement leaned hard into this idea. In newspapers, sermons and early wellness pamphlets, struggling men were told to seek honest work, country air, manual labour, and godly stillness to overcome their ailments. The implication was clear: if you were still addicted, you simply hadn't tried hard enough. This cultural tone was reflected in advertising too. By the 1880s, some tonics even claimed to cure opium habits, despite the fact that many of these products contained opium themselves. One infamous product, Mrs. Winslow's cure for the nervous condition, promised to gently wean the sufferer from dangerous opiates, while delivering a not-so-gentle daily dose of morphine and alcohol. Even the temperance movement began to overlap with opiate withdrawal narratives, offering moral support, but little medical understanding. Sobriety clubs sprang up in small towns, mostly focused on alcohol, but welcoming any man who could white-knuckle his way through the shakes and not talk about it too loudly. In some cases, veterans were sent to work farms, or encouraged to move west to build character through homesteading. One 1873 editorial in the Cincinnati Gazette advised, "A man haunted by the poppy spirit must root himself in the land and work until his flesh forgets the craving." No mention of side effects. No mention of death. Just dig a hole and forget your trauma. It was a national epidemic disguised as rural virtue, and for thousands of men this meant facing withdrawal not just without support, but with shame, in silence, in barns, in kitchens, in the dust of country roads. They chopped wood until their hands blistered, dug ditches until their vision blurred. And when the shaking got too bad to ignore, many quietly wandered back into town and bought another bottle. Because it turned out that grit, fresh air and Protestant guilt weren't quite enough to cure chemical dependency. You've heard the West will heal you. Big skies, clean air, hard work. Apparently that's all you need to cure the shakes, the night sweats, and your habit of yelling at furniture. Perfect. You're practically cured just thinking about it. You pack your things, one blanket, one hat, one bottle of medicine, from your cousin labelled for nerves and other complaints. You are other complaints. You climb onto the wagon like a man climbing into a fresh start. Day 1. You're picturing yourself as a rugged pioneer, a new man ploughing the land and plucking virtue straight from the soil. You even hum a little tune. It sounds almost hopeful. Day 3. Your back hurts, your head hurts, your soul feels like it's being chased by raccoons with hammers. You've already finished half the ham and named your boots left and good left just to stay entertained. Day 5. A man named Clem hands you a jar of prairie tonic. You ask what's in it. He says, "It'll make you forget to care what's in it." That's good enough. You drink it. It tastes like licorice and mild regret. You sleep 14 hours and wake up hugging a fence post you're pretty sure you built in your dreams. The West is gorgeous. The sunsets look like heaven. The stars stretch forever. And you're still a man hiding a bottle under his coat, pretending to be cured while sweating through his shirt at sunrise. Turns out trauma isn't a city habit. It rides shotgun on the wagon. As the post-war years rolled on, veterans, particularly those struggling with opiate dependence, were encouraged to move westward, under the belief that honest labour, clean living, and isolation could cure what medicine could not. Newspapers, pamphlets, and even physicians began suggesting that addiction and nervous disorders were diseases of the city, or habits of idle men. The solution, they said, was dirt. land, ploughs, back-breaking work. This was not treatment. This was moral relocation. The Homestead Act of 1862 made land grants available to thousands of Americans, including former soldiers. It sounded ideal. 160 acres of opportunity in exchange for a few years of labour. For addicted veterans, it became a socially acceptable escape hatch. No one had to say he's addicted. They said he's going west to find himself, and many did. Some sincerely hoped a new setting would bring healing. Others simply wanted to disappear, to shake off the watchful eyes of neighbours, family and doctors who'd begun to suspect that restlessness and melancholy were just polite ways of saying hooked. The problem was they took the addiction with them. So did the suppliers. Patent medicines didn't stop at the Mississippi. In fact, they often thrived out west where regulation was looser and scrutiny was rarer. Travelling salesmen carried tonics in crates. General stores stocked heroes' elixirs. Even small newspapers ran ads promising a return to strength through drops, syrups and tinctures that, unbeknownst to most, still relied heavily on morphine and opium. One Kansas newspaper in 1878 ran an ad for Fortitude Formula, a settler's best friend, boasting that it could cure all complaints of the nerves, settle the stomach, and quiet the troubled veteran. It didn't mention the laudanum. It didn't have to. So many former soldiers quietly rebuilt their lives on borrowed land, in new towns with old habits. They ploughed fields during the day and dosed themselves at night. They built fences and sheds and reputations, while keeping their bottles out of sight, hidden in barns, cupboards, coat pockets. Some eventually weaned themselves off. Others drank until they couldn't hold a plough anymore, and a few simply vanished into the prairie, known only as a good man who kept to himself. But the truth followed them west, because for many it wasn't about forgetting the war, it was about trying to remember who they were before the bottle, and the further they travelled, the harder that memory became to find. The West didn't fix you. It gave you freckles, a sunburn, and a chicken named Wallace, who stares at you like he knows your secrets, but your nerves, still rattling like a snare drum in a thunderstorm. So you pivot careers, you are now, heaven help us, a patent medicine salesman. Yes, you. A man who can't sleep through his own dreams, hawking Dr. Elwell's celebrated calmative cordial, like it's salvation in a bottle, which in fairness it is, just not the way the customers think. You stand on a crate in the town square, swaying slightly because you've sampled the product 3 times already. You throw your arm out like a revival preacher. Gentlemen, ladies, children who look like they've seen things, do you suffer from nervous unrest, phantom pains, or the inability to stop glaring at squirrels? Then behold, you shake the bottle dramatically. Wallace the chicken pecks at your boot on cue like a sidekick. A crowd forms. You don't stop. It soothes the nerves, fortifies the blood, restores moral courage and possibly your hairline. Great for the patriotic soul and also your cousin who keeps fainting at church. They laugh. You sell 3 bottles before lunch. By sunset, you're behind the tavern, sitting on an overturned barrel, drinking your own stock and wondering if this counts as gainful employment or inventing a travelling relapse. Wallace hops up next to you and pecks your sleeve like he's your manager asking for his cut. You sigh. Business is good, your nerves are quiet, and you're pretty sure you've just sold morphine, alcohol and a hint of mint to 5 unsuspecting farmers and 1 priest. You call that progress. As the century turned, a new kind of addict emerged. Not the soldier hiding in his bedroom, not the farmhand dosing in the barn, but the travelling tonic man, who both consumed and sold the very substance undoing him. Patent medicine salesmen were a peculiar breed, part huckster, part preacher, part pharmacist, and sometimes, ironically, former patients. The American addiction crisis didn't just affect individuals, it built careers. The booming patent medicine industry created opportunity for men who knew the product intimately, because they had once used it themselves. Former soldiers, especially those who looked rugged or battle-hardened or then tossed, were ideal salesmen. They carried authenticity, credibility, and the kind of desperation that reads well in a pitch. You didn't need a storefront. You needed a crate, a good voice, and a bottle with a convincing label. Townsfolk gathered at fairs, markets, even Sunday socials to watch a man tell them he had been broken, nearly destroyed, and brought back to life by a syrup that smelled suspiciously like moonshine and cloves. Advertisements from the 1880s featured testimonials from men claiming to have survived the horrors of Gettysburg and the worse horrors of sleeplessness, cured by Dr. Marvel's invigorating restorative. One actual broadside from 1879 included this pitch. He served the Union with honour, then returned home with ailments unspoken. Now he stands before you, healed and strong thanks to nature's true physician. The bottle contained morphine, alcohol and belladonna. Many of these travelling salesmen died young, some from overdose, others from exposure, many from simple neglect. But while they lived, they carried the American contradiction with them, that healing and harm could come in the same bottle, depending entirely on the font used on the label. The veteran had become not only the victim, but the messenger. And with every swig behind the wagon, every speech in front of a courthouse, every coin pocketed after promising relief they themselves couldn't sustain, they spread the cure and the disease in one cheerful gulp. You're back in an institution, not the same one. This one has curtains. Fancy. They call it a sanitarium, which is 19th century for we ran out of synonyms for asylum. Supposedly it's progressive. It has a garden, a reading room, and a man down the hall who thinks he's Napoleon and calls you Captain Turnip. You answer to it. Why not? At this point you're basically a garnish in human form. The brochure promised rest and recovery. What you got was oatmeal, cold walks at sunrise, and no opium whatsoever. Apparently the cure for opium addiction is don't have any. Revolutionary. You're here for your health, but it feels like boot camp for ghosts. Every morning you wake up in a scratchy bed, staring at the ceiling like you're in a very slow duel with God. You shuffle to the garden. You admire the flowers. You hate the flowers. You contemplate eating the flowers just to feel something. Your eye twitches. Your hands shake. Someone is playing a hymn on the piano very badly. You consider smothering the piano with a pillow. They call this healing. You call it expensive boredom. But you stick with it, because what else can you do? You're too tired to run and too sober to hallucinate your way out. And horrifyingly, you're starting to remember things. Real things. Not the soft blur of laudanum. Actual memories. They're loud, and they smell like blood. You used to think sobriety meant freedom. Now you're starting to suspect it just means being awake for your own misery. Still, you pull on your coat, you take your walk, you mutter at the pigeons, you tell yourself you're improving, even as your body shakes like a tambourine. Because that's what they tell you here. Stick to the routine and you'll get better. Maybe you will, maybe you won't. But at least for now, you've stopped calling the curtain rod General Grant, and that's progress. As addiction among Civil War veterans grew more visible, a wave of institutions began to rebrand themselves, not as asylums, but as sanitariums and health retreats. These facilities promised peace, routine, fresh air, and moral rehabilitation for those suffering from what they delicately termed nervous afflictions. What they meant was addiction. By the 1880s, veteran admissions to mental hospitals and sanitariums had spiked. Records show diagnoses like melancholia, soldier's heart, exhaustion of will, and irritable insanity, all polite workarounds for a condition no one wanted to name, opiate withdrawal, often combined with long-term dependency. These institutions were often well-intentioned, but poorly equipped. With no real treatments and minimal understanding of addiction, most simply isolated patients, enforced rigid schedules, and withheld substances cold turkey. Recovery was expected to arrive through nature walks, Bible study, oatmeal, and the occasional application of electric belts. One Illinois facility, praised in the press for its modern care, reportedly locked men in padded rooms for 3 days before letting them touch a book. Another boasted of its no-medicine approach, while quietly sedating the worst cases with chloral hydrate and camphor oil. Doctors debated causes. Was addiction inherited? Was it spiritual? Was it a character flaw brought on by war, liquor, or feminine influence? One 1887 article in the New York Tribune claimed, "The soldier addicted to opiates must not be treated as criminal, but a sick man overcome by the lingering ghosts of war. Let him be removed from temptation, and guided back to strength by order and prayer. But there was no real treatment, only management. And while some men genuinely recovered in these facilities, many simply learned to perform improvement well enough to be released, only to relapse days later in the same town where they first bought their cure. The sanitariums filled, emptied, and filled again, and the cycle continued. Because when addiction is treated like a shameful secret instead of a medical reality, the cure becomes just another kind of prison, cleaner, quieter, and scented with lavender soap. But a prison nonetheless. You're out. They said you were stable. You didn't argue. You smiled, shook hands, and walked out of that sanitarium like a man reborn, which is impressive, considering you're already on your third nervous system. You move into a boarding house, quiet, respectable, you eat toast, you attend church, you flinch at spoons, but you're sober, technically. You've replaced laudanum with lukewarm tea and frequent silent screaming. Your landlady suggests you take up a hobby. You try whittling. You stab yourself. You try journaling. The pages read like confessions from a haunted accordion. You're doing fine, except you cry during breakfast, and you yell at the wallpaper, and last Tuesday you tried to pet a chimney sweep because you thought he was a dog. So when you find a bottle labelled herbal drops for gentlemen of tense disposition, you don't ask questions, you uncork it, and the world goes soft again. Even as sanitariums expanded, relapse was common and quietly expected. Families rarely discussed it. Employers looked the other way. Society at large assumed men would grow out of it. But addiction doesn't respond to politeness. In cities and small towns, former patients returned to old patterns. Some turned to alcohol. Others found new remedies labelled as herbal, natural, or non-narcotic, often containing small, undisclosed doses of opium, cocaine, or morphine in diluted forms. A popular 1890s blend, Dr. Temple's Tranquil Tonic, claimed to contain no offensive substances, despite being 40% alcohol and marketed directly to men leaving recovery homes. Veterans often didn't realise they were relapsing. They believed they were switching to something milder, something respectable. It was easier to believe the bottle was medicinal than to admit the war was still inside them, and the labels were happy to oblige. You're tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixes, the kind that sits in your bones like a bad tenant and refuses to move out. You've tried everything. Tea, prayer, tonic, fresh air, screaming into barrels, all the usual remedies. And for a while they work. You have good days. You laugh at a joke. You eat stew without crying. You even walk past the apothecary without going in. Once. But then it rains. Or a backfire sounds like artillery. Or someone says hospital, and suddenly you're 20 again, bleeding, begging for more drops just to make it quiet. You're not addicted, you tell yourself. You're just staying afloat. And if that bottle in the drawer helps you do that, who's really counting? You survived the war. No one taught you how to survive the peace. By the late 19th century, many Civil War veterans were still quietly using. They weren't derelicts or drunks. They were postmasters, blacksmiths, teachers, grandfathers, men with medals in drawers and tremors in their hands. Their addiction didn't look like collapse. It looked like functioning pain. In census records and pension files, references appear to nervous conditions, melancholia, and chronic reliance on tinctures. Doctors still avoided the word addict. Families used phrases like, he needs his medicine, or he has his ways. In truth, thousands of men carried opium dependency for decades, managing it quietly, respectfully, until the day they didn't. There were no national statistics, no long-term studies, just gravestones and rumours, bottles in attics, letters stained with shaky handwriting and final apologies. Their stories weren't told, their suffering wasn't named, but they existed. Between the headlines, in the quiet places, where war lingers long after the last shot, and where the real cost isn't just what a soldier gave to the battlefield, but what he had to keep living with after he came home. And now, as the final boot is unbuckled and the parlour glows with a warm haze of laudanum bottles, smudged enlistment papers, and one particularly judgmental chicken named Wallace, I hope this grim little march through Civil War addiction lingers, like the scent of camphor and tobacco tucked into field kits, hiding pain and regret in equal measure. You've survived sawdust surgeries, patent medicine miracles, phantom limbs, and more euphemisms for nervous invalid than should be legally permitted. But for now, it's time to rest. The stretcher's been folded, the uniform is back on its peg, and the comrade on the next cot is finally quiet. Blissfully unaware you slipped his name into your pension papers. If you're still awake. Impressive. You've just endured the Republic's most polite attempt at pretending addiction was a moral failing instead of a medical wound. And you didn't even get a medal or a government pamphlet. Hit subscribe so we can slip into another tale of smoke-lined defiance tomorrow night. And as you drift, the soft crackle of the fire will carry you deeper, far from trembling hands and half-empty bottles, and into sleep.